Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Certara Talks. I'm Dr. Suzanne Minton, and I'm a director of content strategy at Certara. Today, I'm here with my colleagues, Dr. Oksana Ilyich, David Weshy, Rajesh Krishna, and Paul Martin, and we are going to be talking about Rare Disease Day, which this year is on February 29th. With all drugs, the regulatory aspect is a really important one. From a regulatory perspective, for this group, what are the combined efforts or expertise that you feel lead to a successful rare disease drug submission?
Yeah, it's a really good question because I've been working on the multiple drug development and submissions from a regulatory perspective. And from my experience, the successful one combined expertise and expert from multiple stakeholders. That includes, of course, company, but the big contribution has to come from the patient groups because patients actually knows the disease better than anyone else, and also from the subject matter expert in the clinical expert area, non-clinical area, and sometimes even the area that nobody is thinking, such as pharmacovigilance, pharmacology, modeling and simulation. And again, successful drug development submission and approval usually have a very strong regulatory strategy at the core that is clearly defined the major milestones and keep all of those major stakeholders engaged and properly align on the development and have a appropriate timing communications with the health authorities to make sure that the development is not being derailed and it's focusing on achieving their goals.
I think from a regulatory context, one of the things that have been fast moving, I would say, is changing regulatory landscape. One of the things that if you watch the FDA advisory committees that deliberate on many treatments, but in particular rare disease treatments, the concept of biologic plausibility keeps coming up. What is the biomarker that we need to use? Is the biomarker tracking with the disease indication? How well do we know the natural history of disease? So I think the changes in framework that exists between common diseases and rare diseases need to be better appreciated, especially in the context of understanding disease progression and how do we incorporate natural history of disease along with our registrational track. So I think the combination of data science, sound regulatory strategy, and clinical trial data are going to be paramount in any rare disease regulatory submission.
Makes sense.
So I could add that for me, what's very important is the team approach. None of us is an expert in everything, and yet we bring expertise to the table. And so having a multidisciplinary team approach to drug development, especially in the rare disease area where we sometimes have to think outside of the box, is vitally important as we pull together our regulatory submissions. I would also like to add that sometimes the partnership includes that of the regulatory agency. For example, there's a breakthrough designation for therapies at the FDA that allows us to interface with the experts in the regulatory space in order to make a more efficient program. And so that back and forth and common approach to developing drugs as a team is quite important, I think, to making a successful submission.
Fantastic. So we talked about, Dave, I like how you brought about how drug developers need to work with regulatory agencies as partners. Does this team have any thoughts on, are there any specific regulatory challenges that are that rare disease drug development programs need to think about?
Well, I can start probably again that really interesting discussion on this very interesting questions. Well, definitely rare diseases development present very specific and multiple challenges. And from a regulatory perspective, every rare disease development is very unique. And that's in combination with the changing landscape of the regulatory requirements. When we think lately about development drug for rare diseases, somehow the first thing that comes to mind is cell and gene therapies, because about 80% of the rare disease have a genetic origin. Not surprisingly, this is a huge development, but somewhat forgotten or not so attractive, I would say, drug development is the repurposing of drugs for rare diseases, because let's face it, there are millions and thousands of patients with the different rare diseases, and we could not develop for every disease a new drug. And there's a very successful stories of drug repurposing, but the repurposing by itself presents significant regulatory challenges from the perspective of interactions with the agency, engagements with the stakeholders, leveraging the data that are already available in the public domain, and also working between the regulatory strategy, marketing strategy, and the patents and the legal rights protection strategy. So this is a very unique strategies and a very unique challenges that I personally experienced when I was involved in several developments of repurposing of the drug for the rare diseases from a regulatory perspective. And of course, I will be very interested to see what my other colleagues have to say on this topic.
Yeah, I think one of the things that there is it's sort of like a healthy tension within the rare diseases development value chain is the weight of evidence. How much weight of evidence do you need to be convinced ourselves that there is a signal, and how much weight of evidence that you need to show from a regulatory approvability point of view. The standard clinical trial designs, for example, randomized double-blind, controlled trials, which are gold standard for new drug development, may not actually be meaningfully available for rare diseases, because some of the rare diseases, and more importantly for ultra rare diseases, where you have at best 2 patients, 3 patients. So coming up with novel trial designs, the N of 1 design, for example, or using drug repurposing framework, or finding a digital biomarker that can provide that system continuity in terms of new algorithm, AI, ML, that can provide that integration with other system components. Those aspects are brought in a more pressing way. Oksana's relationship with Iridic is a good example that brings that public-private partnership, and how do we promulgate some of those concepts. But those are some of the things that I think there needs to be a conversation, at the very least a conversation with the regulatory agency, and get alignment with those kinds of components before embarking on a clinical trial design that sort of is a fit for purpose.
I think for me in this zone, it's really a sort of build on what Rajesh just said. So it's to do with endpoints, actually. And so when you're in a new disease, there's no established endpoint. Just getting those endpoints established and providing that evidence. And I guess also getting the community to sort of have a common thread or a common understanding of what that evidence is, actually. So that's the one for me, actually. So
I'd like to thank my colleagues, Dr. Oksana Aliich, Dr. Paul Martin, Dr. David Wesche, and Dr. Rajesh Krishna for having a fantastic conversation about rare diseases. I'm Suzanne Minton. You've been watching Certara Talks. I'll see you next time.